This is a compilation video of Quickies that were once uploaded to my main channel. I moved them off there since they were cluttering the place up between my main videos. While I have divided each of them up based on anime season, there may be some things from other anime seasons mixed in there, as I may have watched things that were from a prior season during that one. You will find timestamps for each anime talked about in each of these compilations in the description. Thank you. Anime finished this year number 34, Sasaki and Miyano. 9 out of 10. This one just feels incredibly sweet without veering into the realm of being saccharine. Just two characters figuring things out together bit by bit, sharing their passions and coming to what feels like almost an inevitable conclusion. It plays a little with BL tropes, but it's in this way that feels more like it's trying to be a love letter to the genre rather than trying to play all of those tropes completely straight. This one feels like a slow burn in some ways, but it's not entirely. More of a medium burn, if that makes sense. Sasaki gets his feelings pretty sorted out after just a little while, and admits to them fairly readily, which I personally found to be pretty refreshing. However, Miyano is kind of caught off guard by this, since he was just really starting to have an inkling and needs more time to figure things out. And even once he does, he still needs more time to be sure. However, it's so clear that this comes from a place of earnest overthinking that you can't really blame the guy. There is always this feeling of there being forward momentum in the relationship. It might not seem like big strides are being made in the day-to-day, but the little steps do eventually get us to our destination. I do like when we get an admittance of feelings early on in the season, but so often when that happens, it can end up feeling like something of a speed run. For example, Horimiya had an early feelings admittance, but to me it felt rushed in comparison, as we went from these characters never having spoken to being engaged over the course of one season in the midst of what felt like too many subplots from the rest of the cast. That's what I especially appreciated about Sasaki and Miyano, that the focus was kept where it needed to be. I've noticed that some romance series lately have this habit of creating an extended cast and then deciding that every single one of those cast members needs a subplot, but that can really stretch things thin at times. In this case, yes, we have an extended cast, and a few of them do have things going on, but they're small things, so that we're never pulling too much time away from our main relationship, which is what gives them a more fleshed out relationship and makes it more believable. I have to see the couple together in their everyday lives to believe that there's really something there, not just a highlight reel of the big moments. Those little small moments can mean so much too. Anime finished this year number 35, Salaryman's Club, 8 out of 10. I never heard of this one aside from stumbling across it myself on Crunchyroll, so I feel like this was one of those cases where a show just got overlooked in the seasonal shuffle, or dismissed because clearly anything with an all-male main cast must just be bait for girls or BL lovers. But you know what? Salaryman's Club is pretty dang great. It's not perfect or anything. The animation for the matches feels nice and weighty and impressive at the start of the series, but ends up falling off, only to pick back up again at the end of the season. That's not surprising, but it is a little disappointing. Thankfully, the characters being a lot of fun is able to make up for it. I personally really appreciated the fact that we were able to get a sports series about grown men rather than teenagers for once, and that it came along with them dealing with actual adult problems. A good portion of the show is them dealing with work-related problems before they have to get to practice. I can understand why some people might find that to be a distraction from the main point of the show, but I personally really liked it. It gives the show a nice balance to it and makes sure that it doesn't end up coming off just like one of those school sports shows by following the same beats. We got plot lines that I normally wouldn't get, like a player who's got a skill gap because he's returning to the sport after a 7-year hiatus, or a player who is simply getting older and that holds him back. The entire thing is plain and simple, a lot of fun, and the dynamics were always entertaining. I won't say that it's one of the best things I've watched this year, but I'd put it down as being just a few steps behind Haikyuu. However, I should clarify that that's only because this is a single season, which means we weren't able to get the same level of depth to the characters that Haikyuu has been able to get across multiple seasons. Other teams, save for a few exceptions, are much more one-dimensional in comparison. But that's okay, the focus was on the characters that mattered. Anime finished this year number 36, 2.34 Seiin High School Boys Volleyball Team. 6 out of 10. I suppose the one thing that needs to be gotten out of the way is the question of how this compares with Haikyuu, the other big volleyball anime that people tend to know. The thing is, I don't think the two are really comparable besides the fact that they're sports anime about the same sport. The two have their source in very different mediums and are focused on different things. Haikyuu comes from a manga, a visual medium, so it focuses a lot on the meticulous detail of the game and getting us to know one team of characters that we will follow long term very intimately. On the other hand, Seiin comes from a light novel, where that meticulous detail of a game is indeed possible, but doesn't come off the same in a text medium as it does a visual one. As a result, Seiin is more of a character drama centered around volleyball, rather than being strictly about playing volleyball. The sport is what connects characters together and drives a lot of their motivations, but the games themselves aren't treated the same as Haikyuu, where they can sometimes be framed as like ultimate battles. It's really apples to oranges on some level. I would encourage Haikyuu fans, of course, to give it a try, but it's ultimately going to be up to personal taste on whether you'd really like it or not. No harm in trying to expand your anime horizons, though. Haikyuu does have better volleyball animation. However, since gameplay is very much the focus of that series, that is what I would expect. Seiin has a strong focus on a small handful of characters most of the time, which means there's a lot of others who do end up feeling like they're falling to the wayside, though I wouldn't rule out them coming into more focus if a second season were ever to happen, though with a lot of the source material being used up already, that might be a long ways off. Many of them just kind of blend together as a result of not being super distinct, but the drama that does crop up with the ones that get a little more screen time is both interesting and understandable for the characters. If you like melodrama, this show has it in spades. The one thing that was weird to me, though, was after a certain point in the series, it felt like the opposing team's characters were getting just as much screen time and development as our main cast, which felt a little odd. Not to say that this development was bad or uninteresting, in fact, I ended up liking them a lot, and it's always better when the opposing team isn't just some one-note villain. However, a lot of time was dedicated to them in the back half of the season, and I don't really think there's any reason for them to come up again after this point, so it ends up feeling like some of that time might have been better spent on fleshing out our main team before throwing them into the nationals. Anime finished this year number 37, Mob Psycho 100 Season 2. 9 out of 10, last season being an 8 out of 10. Mob Psycho Season 2 was very much just as good as the first season. In some aspects, it might have been even better too. I loved it a lot, and I'm glad that I got caught up just in time to watch the third season as it airs. Obviously, the animation and presentation of this was just as divine as the first time around. The entire thing is so well done that it's hard, if not impossible, to ever look away from the screen when the animation team really pulls things out. It's beautiful, plain and simple, a real work of art. For what this one did better, I think a lot of that was related to the way that the season was very much focused on showcasing the relationships that Shigeo has developed over the course of the series. I personally was left leaning back in my seat at the end of the arc about Keiji Mogami, wondering if it was the right thing to peak so early in the season. Well, I was wrong about that because this series did nothing but trend upward in story quality from there. Mob really has a wonderful arc here, having learned so much over the course of 2 seasons that he's able to put what he's learned about forming relationships and a community with others to good use and pass it on to other characters who still need to learn it. It's so sweet and wonderful. I can't help but want to see where he'll go from here in continuing to learn and grow. That's the best thing about this series, the way that it makes you feel so damn proud of the little guy. However, I have to say it's always a little strange for me when the story ends up going down the route of being some kind of big shonen battle type thing at points, when the series is very much a slice of life otherwise. Whenever we have these big psychic battles, the moments of characterization are what are interesting to me, not whatever the characters are able to do with their powers. That being said, there's nothing wrong with the series going in that direction. I just find myself favoring the quieter moments rather than the big blowout ones. Anime finished this year number 38, Neon Genesis Evangelion. 8 out of 10. One of my goals for this year was to watch a handful of the anime classics that I had missed out on over the years, and one of those classics was Eva. It does not escape me that what I just finished watching by watching the series alone without any other supplemental material was a fundamentally unfinished project and story. Even as someone who had never watched the show until now, I was well aware of the story of how this production was basically in shambles by the time it reached the end. Still, for what was there, I enjoyed it a lot, though I can't help but feel that it would have hit me harder if I had watched this when I was in high school. I dealt with a lot of self-loathing as a teenager that I have mostly sorted out these days, but it took up a lot of feelings about myself when I was younger. I think that if I had watched this then, the final 2 episodes of Evangelion would have made a pretty strong emotional impact on me, even if they didn't give me the narrative conclusion that I was hoping for. It is a series that has held up, and I can totally understand why people feel such a connection to it all these years later. I'm someone that, while I've watched a small handful of mech shows, they're not typically ones that I go seeking out. Yet this one had me pretty hooked early on in the run. There were some places where it genuinely got under my skin and got to me, which is what it's meant to do. It's why we seek out media, to give us an emotional catharsis. And even if this one didn't hit me as hard as it might have when I was younger, it certainly still gave me that. At the same time, though, this is not a landmark that is without its problems. There is little that transitions us between the end of episode 24 and what follows after it, and you can really tell that those 2 episodes aren't where the series was intended to cut off and end. Additionally, while I do enjoy the underlying message of the final 2 episodes, I still find them rather meandering, and the pseudo-philosophical ramblings are just that, rambly and unfocused. I don't mind the limited animation used to bring them to life, and actually like the use of more abstract images to show the characters, but that doesn't stop the episodes from feeling largely repetitive for a good portion of their runtime, or make them feel like a full finale to everything that actually came before. With that, though, it just gives me more reason to get into everything else that came after the conclusion of the main series, I suppose. Anime finished this year number 39, Phantom of the Idol, 5 out of 10. Yeah, this one ended up being just kind of okay. What started as a pretty solid premise ended up not quite getting used as much as you would have thought that it would. Sure, the idol ghost girl does take over his body a bunch, but even early on into the series, she seems resistant to do so, despite how much she longs to be on stage, because of this notion that it would deny our main character the chance to grow as an idol himself if she took over all the time. Which, that's fine if that's the angle you want to go for. It makes sense if the whole joke of the thing is seeing the contrast between his god mode and trash mode of performances. However, if that's the case, they need to stop having so much talk about how even after death she's an idol, how she yearns to take the stage again. When you're making it half her personality that she longs to be on stage again, it starts feeling weird when she's not taking every opportunity she's offered to do that. Once again, I understand from a narrative perspective why she doesn't, but it doesn't always work from a character level. The other issue for me is that the comedic bit of this series doesn't always land, and there are points where the jokes can feel a touch repetitive. If I had binged this series instead of watching week to week, I think that might have caused me to think less favorably of it. The one running thing that actually did get me to smile was the little group of fans that we followed over the course of the season. Their over-the-top obsession and reactions to things was a lot of fun, though I know that in reality a group this obsessed would hardly be as wholesome as these ladies. Oh, there's also little to no reason to watch the final episode to some extent. It's just the concert that they've been building up to over the course of the season. It runs down every song, plus some new ones, and most of the rest is just that idol concert between song banter. Very comedy duo stuff that just doesn't land for me. There was also, 2 other moments for the characters that weren't that, but otherwise, You could skip it without much issue, or even just skim through the episode to see those character bits. The final episode was the point where the show actually started to feel like it was trying to sell me an idol group, which I wasn't into, but that's hard to do when the performance sequences never improved. I'll say this, the actual animation work with these CG sequences is just fine. The problem is that the models and their compositing are completely awful. They're always completely lit with no shading or shadows at all, so they never really feel like they're part of the scene. Then the models themselves have no real physics to them. Arms and legs bend and move, but the fabric of their clothes never moves or flows, acting more like cardboard tubes around their bodies the whole time. It's one thing to have a short bit of this once an episode, but it's another to spend half the runtime of the finale just staring at it. Anime finished this year number 40, Land of the Lustrous. 7 out of 10. I think the biggest barrier for entry to this show, besides the fact that you might need to get over your bias towards 3D animated anime, is the fact that the opening of the series is a pretty slow burn. Foss, while relatable, is a bit of an annoying character at first, and it does take some time for them to really come into their own as an interesting protagonist. That being said, this is very much a coming-of-age story, even if Foss is already hundreds of years old at the start of it. It's about growing up and changing and discovering things about not only yourself, but about others too. It's also a little tragically about how sometimes those who are helping you to become the person you're ultimately meant to be might not be there to see who you end up as. How trauma can make you have to grow up too fast all at once and snatch away some of that innocent joy that you used to have. By the end of the series, Foss is not the same person that they were at the start. There are glimmers of who they used to be, sure, but those glimmers aren't altogether the same person that we started out with. It's beautifully contrasted by one of the scenes at the end of the show where Foss walks past their former self, and there's tragedy in that, in a way. Foss started a journey of self-improvement early on in the series, but by the end, they don't even remember why they started that journey, which contrasts amazingly with the way that Cinnabar remembers the exact words of the promise that Foss made them. The other major problem with the series is the way that it is clearly directing you to read the manga at the end, which I've started doing as a result because I want to see more. However, the anime leaves off just as some really interesting questions are getting raised. They try to wrap it up as best they could, but unfortunately it leaves off in the middle of a mini arc that's the start of a larger saga, so it's left feeling a little incomplete. Anime finished this year number 41, Yurei Deco, 6 out of 10. Y'all, I'm upset. At the start of the season, this was actually one of my top shows, and I was a little bit mad that it seemed to be flying under the radar. The first 3 episodes were great, but it's in the 4th episode that things start to crumble bit by bit, which I was slightly disappointed by at first, and annoyed with by the end. The first 3 episodes not only introduced us to the world of the show, but also showed us some of the major problems with it, dealing with the darkness of how some people fall through the cracks of society with absolutely beautiful animation. However, episode 4 comes in with a sudden time skip, huge shift in what part of the city our characters are in, and the sudden addition of several characters with little to no explanation. However, I was still willing to give the series a chance, even as the middle languished in the realm of episodic mysteries that ended up having tiny main plot connections, enough that you needed to watch the episode, but not so much that I think the series couldn't have ultimately condensed a few episodes down a little. Then the final arc kicks in at a breakneck pace into a final episode that feels both rushed and like there's not enough in it all at the same time. For me, the real downswing started when we spent a whole episode building up to and introducing a really interesting and lovable robot character that the cast instantly connects with, only for them to just not react at all when he's murdered right in front of them for what feels like cheap shock value. And then we get into one of my least favorite types of anime endings, a character that we've basically just met going off on pseudo-philosophical ramblings about the nature of the world the show has created that ultimately don't mean very much, give a very weak motivation for all their actions, and do not excuse the actions that they took. Then one character does something all big determination style, and they're satisfied and everything changes. In this case, it was a good few minutes of talk from a character that had the very least orchestrated 2 deaths that we know of and gotten our main characters branded essentially public enemy number 1, talking all about how they're tired of running things and we're going to pass on the job. The system that we were shown from the beginning is in some ways fundamentally broken, is actually just fine, and just needs one special person to make a few tweaks that'll fix everything. It's just so disappointing to see the series veer off course like this, especially since a lot of the characters were really endearing. The design and animation for this one were wonderful, and I thought from the beginning that it was going to have something to say. It almost feels like one person started the thing and then someone else wrote the rest. It is a really strong start, but gets off track and then never recovers after that point. I had fun, but I don't think I have any reason to watch this again after seeing how it all came together in the end. Anime finished this year number 42, RWBY, Ice Queendom, 8 out of 10. To get out of the way, yes, I am a fan of the original RWBY series, but I'm not someone who's been there since the beginning. I jumped on in 2020. For those who aren't fully aware of what this series is meant to be, no, it's not a retelling of the original in a different form of animation. It speedruns the early portion of the original, yeah, but that's more to use it as a jumping off point for its own ideas. It's better to think of this as a strongly tied alternate universe story rather than a replacement if you're thinking about getting into RWBY. All that to say, I did enjoy this when I was taking it on the level that it's trying to be at. I think if you're trying to look at this from the perspective of where the current RWBY series is, it's going to be a bit hard, but remembering the early season versions of those characters, a lot of what is going on here makes sense, and it's very good to see them taking on a more long-term adventure while still at school, when stories back in that era were typically much shorter. I will say, if you are someone who is very invested in the character of Weiss, then this is going to be good eating for you. Much of the season is an intimate exploration of her mind, with other small arcs for characters peppered about the place. I was actually really happy to see them go pretty in depth about the relationship between Weiss and Blake, especially when it comes to the biases that Weiss has been raised with and is still working to overcome in some ways. It's great. You know what else is great? The action in this series. It's obviously very different from the way the action is handled in the 3D animated version, but most of the time it still looks pretty stellar. There are a few places where it feels like things could have been more cleaned up or fluid, but part of me wants to believe that's just a byproduct of the whole thing being done by the studio Shaft, which tends to favor a more frenetic and off-the-wall animation style. That doesn't mean the animation is perfect, though. The little moments of animation can be incredibly impressive and fluid, but sometimes some of the anatomy can get a little wonky here or there, and the eyes of the characters just don't work for me. A lot of detail has been put into these eyes, but it's a bit too much for them to actually look great all the time. There are points where they look really beautiful and expressive, but there are also points where the eyes of some characters can just look kind of dead. I tended to notice it more with the background characters getting the dead eye thing compared to the main cast, and I can understand that since they're not the main focus of the series, but that doesn't help their case. That being said, I think fans of the series who go into this with an open mind are going to like it just fine, but I know it's not going to be for everyone. However, it's not really a great place for you to jump on as someone who has no investment at all. Anime finished this year number 43, Tokyo Mew Mew New, 8 out of 10. This might not be a perfect adaptation of the manga, but hey, it's a pretty damn fine one nonetheless, and honestly, a pretty refreshing show to get right about now. You see, outside the ever-continuing and popular Pretty Cure franchise and the revitalization of Sailor Moon, a lot of the magical girl shows we've been getting lately fall in the trend of being more for adult anime fans rather than being just a fun kids show. With that comes a need to be seen as serious and for grown-up folk. This resulted in magical girls getting their dark and gritty phase, where it's not actually all sunshine and rainbows and not everything works out, and sometimes really, really bad things happen to our hero girls. I once saw someone refer to this trend as tragical girls, and that couldn't be any more accurate. Which is why a reboot of Tokyo Mew Mew is so refreshing. Sure, a lot of it's set up like a nostalgic series from back in the day, but it worked then and still kind of works now with a few tweaks. The characters still have a decent amount of depth for a Monster of the Week show, and the adventures are fun. Better still, it allows Ichigo to just kind of be a normal teenage girl. Sure, she's saving the world and all, but she's allowed to have just simple teenage girl problems. I like that her biggest issue is that being a superhero gets in the way of her dating the boy she likes. It's one of those simple basics, but the basics can be good if they're done well. We even get to wrap up the season with a nice satisfying little moment for that storyline that rounds everything out nicely. It's clearly meant to be just the first season of a few though, so we'll have to see where things go from here. New animation techniques have upgraded the look of the whole thing, and I love it, though I can completely understand why someone might prefer the older style. The one thing that got to me, though, is that some of the pieces of the transformation are just, they feel a touch geared towards adults. Now, the manga itself did have some light or implied nudity in it, but it was never framed as anything that was meant to be leered at. However, here, there's just one or two shots that don't feel entirely necessary. Like the one where it really focuses on Ichigo's chest for a second before panning up for the appearance of her choker, or the very close-ups of thighs when the garters appear. It's not entirely a deal breaker, but it stood out to me as a bit odd, especially since all the girls got light redesigns to their costumes that for most of them seemed to cover them up a little bit more. All said and done, though, it's a solid first season for a Magical Girl series, and I'm really looking forward to see if they'll give us more of this one. I'll certainly be watching if they do. Anime finished this year number 44, Smile of the Arsnotoria, 3 out of 10. When the summer anime season first started, this was a show that I was ready to drop about 3/4 of the way through the first episode. I had never experienced a cute girls doing cute things show that was so boring before. Sure, there are some that I don't find much interest in, but I had not personally watched one that left me bored out of my skull the whole time. I was all set and ready to start writing about how I was going to drop it, how sometimes boring is worse than being bad, and then that last scene hit. Teasing something darker going on not far away from where everything was tea parties, an actual plot to consider. It was enough to get me to give the show a few more episodes out of curiosity. Around the middle of the season, I considered dropping it again, because 30 seconds to a minute or two of this other plot wasn't enough for me to sit through the still inane and boring stuff with what was supposed to be the main cast. But I kept going, telling myself I would drop it at episode 10 if nothing had happened yet. At episode 10, I said screw it, there's only 2 more left, might as well finish the damn thing. That's the problem with this series, it's one of the longest teases that never pays off. For all the intrigue that it tries to build by using the small scraps of secondary plot, it never ends up actually doing anything. The 2 plot lines literally never intersect, not even in the last episode, which ends with another completely boring tea party, just like it started. I can see a hypothetical person who might like this and not find it as terribly numbing as I did, but that's not me. I regret finishing this show. The only redeeming thing that it has going for it is that the character designs on some of the characters are quite nice, but when I have no interest in those characters or the thin personalities that inhabit those designs, that's not a reason for me to keep up any investment in the show. That's not even getting into how a few of them were actually actively annoying. Anime finished this year number 45, The Yakuza's Guide to Babysitting, 7 out of 10. This is one of our slice of life shows for the season, and it's really a lot of fun. It's one of those shows that falls into the trend of dad anime, where a grown man finds himself suddenly in charge of a child, usually a little girl, and takes on a father or big brother role to her. Yes, I know we all have a little fear and apprehension with these sort of series, given that we've had multiple series pull an Usagi drop on us, but I can confirm that thus far, this one is safe and doesn't seem to have any plans to be otherwise. Thank God. So this is a bit of a comedy as well, and I have to be honest, the episodes where it's going more for comedy are the ones that are worse off. It's not that they're not funny, but they're not side-bustingly so. More that they made me smile rather than outright laugh. These do serve a purpose of getting us just regular moments with the characters, of course, but they're unfortunately not funny enough to stick with me. The only one that really did was episode 4, and that's only because that episode was so lacking in everything else that I really like about the series and felt like it was almost from another show altogether that it stands out like a sore thumb in the lineup. Honestly, you can skip that one with nothing lost, which is a little bit of a disappointment and a problem. This series is at its best when it's focusing on Toru, Yaika, or the relationship between the two of them. It's very much a show about relationships with others and building them. Every single one of the moments that hits really hard has its core in the relationship between 2 characters. Heck, a good portion of the season is about building out a support network of relationships for the once fairly lonely Yaika, about getting her extended family, friends, and people who will look out for her. When it comes to Toru, it's about the relationships that he already has, and might in some ways be taking for granted or not realize how influential they've been on him. About coming to recognize how those relationships have made his life better. It's good stuff. I can definitely see some people getting disappointed by the whole Yakuza thing taking a backseat for a lot of the series, and I do somewhat agree with that. The vast majority of the time, the whole thing is presented as being pretty light and fluffy, with a few jokes here and there about shielding the eyes of the children when a bit of a scuffle happens. There are a few portions that I feel are meant to be brutal beatdowns, but compared to what I've seen of the manga, they do seem to have been toned back somewhat. That's not to say that there's no darkness here, there certainly is, but if you were looking for something that's heavier on the Yakuza and lighter on the babysitting, you might end up feeling like there's too little of it. Anime finished this year number 46, Buchigire, or Shine On Bakumatsu Bad Boys, 6 out of 10. So this show is an anime with a capital A. It's one of those shows that if you ask someone who is just getting into things and perhaps had only watched a few shonen action pieces what anime was like, this is likely kind of what they would describe. Colorful hair, over-the-top character designs, action-packed, wacky characters, it's got all of that. But where it lets me down is with there not being much more than that. You see, this is one where we have a fairly large main cast with a few who are more standout than others. I wouldn't call it an ensemble show because there is a definite main character, but there are a lot of characters that we spend time with. The problem is that all of them are pretty thin. They're basically stock characters, it feels like. They've got the stock personality types, and they rarely do anything that goes beyond the bounds of that. There's nothing entirely wrong with that per se, but I would have liked to see a cast that has a bit more to them is all. The action can be pretty good at times, however, there are supernatural elements to it that I think are both underexplained and underutilized. We don't get much explanation besides that there are souls in the swords, and that's it. The swords glow and all, but it's not made exactly clear how this helps in any way, aside from being a cool visual for the animators to play with. Once again, like the characters, it's not like this was done super badly, but it's more that it was underbaked. The biggest thing that this show has going for it, though, is that the art design is very strong. While I might not like all the choices that are being made, you can't say that they weren't making choices. For example, I've got nothing against the way that flashbacks are being presented in a different aspect ratio. I think that's actually a really cool idea. I just wish that the flashbacks didn't have this ugly blue and orange border around them as a result of that choice. Though my favorite thing that they did is that there's this sort of filter that was put over the whole show that gives it some texture. Like it's playing out on a piece of parchment or something like that. It looks really great, and while I didn't notice it all the time, when I did, it made things stand out a little bit more. I admit I had fun while watching this one at times, and I did like some of the characters, but at its core, it wasn't really doing anything new or even being the best example of the tropes that it's playing with. That being said, when I was first getting into anime as a preteen, this would have absolutely blown my mind before I grew out of it a few years later. So I guess I'm glad that the new generation of fans is getting shows that will do that for them. Anime finished this year number 47, Lycoris Recoil, 7 out of 10. This is a series that took a little while to grab me, if I'm being honest. It was trying to go for this thing where it balances out teenage girls doing improbable feats of action movie greatness with very much showing us that they are still indeed cute teenage girls who like doing cute things in their time off. Well, at least Chisato does, anyway. The problem is that I'm very much someone who's not really into the moe thing. It also had the bad luck of being one of several series that all came out around the same time that featured cute girls, at least partially in some sort of a cafe setting, which was making the season start to feel a little homogenous. That being said, the more the series got into the action-related things, the more it held my interest. The relationship between Chisato and Takina was one that I really loved, and there's no way you can't tell me that at the very least Takina is in love with Chisato. I won't hear it. There wasn't any really big one thing that held me back from enjoying this more. It was a lot of little things. There were some logical issues here and there, like monitors being on in a place where the power was currently cut off, or just everything when it came to Chisato being able to dodge bullets. Look, I get that it's her main character superpower and that she's been trained from a young age with it and yada yada, but it's one of those things that my suspension of disbelief was never able to fully stretch to cover. I know this is a big action movie, essentially, but there were just points where I couldn't roll with how unbelievable all of it was. The other problem for me, like I said, is that the moe side of things just never worked for me, so those portions of the series were a real drag when I was watching them. I know there are plenty of others who are really happy with all that, and I'm happy for them, but it's just not for me. I'll be honest, when we spent half an episode on the underwear of the main characters, that was a problem for me. I didn't find it charming, I found it uncomfortable, especially given that there seemed to have been a deliberate effort not to do that sort of thing up to that point. Now, I know it might sound like I'm being a downer and I didn't like the show. No, actually, I really did. It's just that I liked the back half that was more action-packed than the front half is all. I've been seeing this get praised to high heavens by some, and I just wanted to point out the problems that I had with it as a bit of a counterpoint. The animation on display here was pretty good most of the time, and I really liked a lot of the characters. There is a lot to love here if you're looking for some action thriller goodness. There were just some things that held it back from reaching a peak for me personally, is all. Anime finished this year number 48, Parallel World Pharmacy, 7 out of 10. Wow, I finished a new isekai series. That's pretty damn rare. I haven't made a secret of how I don't like a lot of the modern isekai trends, and to be fair, this series doesn't avoid all of them, but many of them were somewhat mitigated, enough so that I was able to finish the season out. One thing that I really appreciated is that characters other than our main lead were allowed to be smart. Not all of them, to be fair, there's a decent amount of stupidity in this series, but a lot of focus is put on when characters are able to figure things out faster than the main character without the tools that he has at his disposal, which was refreshing in a way when so many isekai lately tend to dumb down other characters in order to hype up the lead. Pharma's dad notices that his kid isn't really the same as his kid has been, notices that huge change, and calls it out. When our main character displays abnormal power, a character appropriately panics at that instead of being wowed. The scope and subject matter of this one is also limited down somewhat, focusing just on medicine and everything that comes along with it, which keeps us from escalating into world-saving escapades. At least right now, anyway. I don't know how things get in the novels. We also have a lack of any harem stuff happening with our characters. There are a handful of female characters around, yeah, but there's just as many male characters too, and none of them have a romantic interest in our main lead. That being said, this one does fall into some of the isekai traps that I'm not fond of. The main character is indeed overpowered to a degree that I don't like. There are some aspects of this that I was fine with, since it was really just an extension of his medical knowledge from his last life that made it impossible for him to practice medicine in the way he knew without the tools and the tests that he was used to having. However, there were other things that felt like they were just too much and completely unneeded, which had me worried we would end the season with some big magic battle, which we didn't quite get, but it was edging on it. It was very close to being a big magic battle moment. Speaking of which, the content of the final 2 episodes was just kind of poorly set up as well. You can't reveal the villain of a whole arc to me in the final episode of not only that arc, but of the show, and have me find that narratively satisfying. It just doesn't work and made the experience feel poorly paced at the end. Anime finishes year number 49, Made in Abyss, The Golden City of the Scorching Sun, also known as Season 2, 7 out of 10, prior season and the movie also being a 7 out of 10. Okay, so I think I need to get it out of the way right away that Made in Abyss is a controversial series that is not for everyone. I enjoy it, but it's a case where I enjoy it with some caveats. This is a show that has some serious flaws to it as a result of the author's proclivities in subject matter that he likes to pursue. I enjoy it despite those. And it's a shame that those elements are there, because otherwise this has a chance that it might have been one of my all-time favorites. This season in particular is just beautifully done. It's a stellar adaptation of the arc that it's covering that has not only emotional resonance, but also fantastic world building and great character beats. There is a lot to love here if you're already interested in the series, but let's be fair, it's not going to win you over if the first season already puts you off. What I personally loved was how much time was spent in one place this season. A lot of the series up to this point had a lot of moving around and forward progress. This was the first time that we were allowed to actually sit in one place and just drink it in for an extended period of time. It made this section feel a lot richer as a result. However, this is tempered by the fact that there is a lot of backstory content this season. Now, I don't mind that for the most part. I love a good backstory, but there were times where I was wishing to just kind of get back to the main cast. It's a lot of new characters to keep track of. Another standout was the use of CG animation this season. It's one of those things that I could tell that's what it was because I've watched a lot of anime, but the way that it was integrated was really amazingly done. The only real giveaway was the smoothness with which it moved. A lot of work went into it clearly, and it shows. Big applause to the team behind this. In the end, I'm left of two minds about Made in Abyss, as I often am. On one hand, it's a beautiful series that builds a rich world and tells interesting stories in that world, but on the other, there are some elements of it that I would much rather be left out, and I don't think that's ever going to really change. It's always going to be this series that I'm not really sure always how to feel about it. Anime finished this year number 50, The Devil is a Part-Timer Season 2. 5 out of 10, with the prior season being a 7 out of 10. I suppose that a 9-year wait is something that could never have been fully lived up to, is it? There's been so much time that the season itself was a surprise to even happen. However, as someone who only actually finished the first season a few months ago after having it on pause for years, even I was disappointed, and I didn't even have time to build up any hype. Unfortunately, this season was just a downgrade in every aspect. The animation itself started out fine, but the longer things went on, the more flat and generic it felt. It seems like a lot of character was missing from it, and when it wasn't able to live up to the fight scenes that it was trying to create, that was kind of the nail in the coffin. Normally this is something I wouldn't really harp on for a comedy or slice of life series, but this season was focused a lot more on the plot-heavy side of things than it was on the more light-hearted elements or the comedy, which that's fine, I guess, but that's not what I come to this series for, really. So for someone like me, I was left feeling bored during these segments. Part of the issue is that with every story, every major enough character needed to come along and be involved. So it never really feels like anyone is getting any focus because everyone is always involved, and thus everyone needs to get enough screen time to justify their involvement. It's passable enough drama, I suppose, but I'm not that invested in the lore side of things for this series. The highlight of the season for me was things like having to navigate buying a TV rather than if the angels were going to take the baby away. Oh yeah, that's right, they added a baby. It's funny, I always think of that being a move that's done by kids shows here in the States as a desperate way to boost ratings, but knowing that this has its basis in a novel, I know that's not the motivation for the show staff, even if it's clear that her presence is supposed to be the kickoff to another set of stories. I never really felt like she added anything aside from being a MacGuffin and some minor character stuff early in the season. By the end, she just kind of blended into the rest of the cast and wasn't much of a consideration anymore. Hell, it's hard to make the baby a consideration when the characters can just poof her away whenever they need to. Honestly, my biggest issue last season is the way that this was a comedy concept trying to grow a plot, and that's the same issue I'm having now, unsurprisingly. And if that's something that other people are into, that's perfectly fine. It's just not what I was looking for out of this. At the same time, though, it's hard for me to get truly upset at a 21-volume long light novel series doing the light novel thing. Anime finished this year number 51, Call of the Night, 6 out of 10. Call of the Night is a series that I never properly clicked with. While there was so much about the general vibe that I loved, for example, the aesthetic way the series depicted empty night streets and the color palette, the story itself and the characters never managed to grab me. I don't know what exactly it was that prevented this, but none of them really held my interest until we got to the vampire hunting detective. However, she was brought in so late in the game that we barely got any time with her, and she had this kind of weird thing where it felt like she was hitting on the middle schooler protagonist a little, which is, kind of uncomfy. Once again, I think it was a case where I was just more actually attracted to the aesthetic of her character rather than any substance behind it. The take on vampires here is a little fresh, though. The concept that in order to create a new vampire, a human must be bitten after falling in love with one. The fact that Ko wants to be a vampire brings up interesting ideas of exactly why he wants to do that. and if someone can brute force their way into falling in love with someone else. The problem is I don't really think we've answered any of that by the end of the season. I understand that this is an adaptation of only a portion of a currently ongoing manga series, so not everything was going to be answered, obviously, but the lack of answers leaves the show feeling like it's leaving off in a somewhat unsatisfying way, even if it managed to come full circle in others. There's also the issue of the main character's age. You see, I don't really have much of an issue with a vampire show getting more into the fan service a little bit, as long as it's not becoming a distraction. Because vampires are very often used as a way to explore or represent the fear of sex or sexuality. However, that gets into a bit of a problem area when our main character is only 14. Granted, the series does not really sexualize him as a character or put him in too many outright sexual situations, but there's one or two points that made me a little uncomfortable with the way they were framed. In the end, what stays with me more for this one is the aesthetic rather than any character or story content, and that's fine. I might even give the manga a try to see if the story is any stronger there, but it does leave me with the feeling that I might not put myself through watching a whole second season if one comes out, and just get my fill of the vibes through sets of GIFs rather than watching the show. Anime finished this year number 52, Futari wa Pretty Cure, 5 out of 10. In my quest to watch more of the classics that I've missed out on, I decided it was finally time that I get into the long-running Pretty Cure franchise. It's a series that I've always wanted to get into, but things just never worked out for one reason or another. Heck, this year I was going to jump in on the currently airing series, but every time I was about to, I was reminded of just how much history there was behind it, and I couldn't. Because there's a part of my brain that always tells me I have to start at the beginning, even if each installment is a standalone. So that's what I did. I went all the way back to the first Precure series to start my journey, and it's alright. This is just one of those things where you can really tell that in a long line of things, this was the first one, because the beginnings are quite simple. That's not to say that it's poorly done at all, though. In fact, I really do love Honoka and Nagisa as characters, and the relationship that develops between the two of them is really wonderful and sweet. The problem is that the series is very repetitive whenever it comes to anything that's not the slice of life elements. While the animation of the fights is really well done the entire time, it's kind of pointless, because in all but a very small handful of episodes, everything is just going to be solved by the stock animation of a big laser to defeat the enemy. The repetition is really the biggest sin of this series. The second biggest sin is how damn annoying the mascot characters are. The temptation to skip episodes where they're the main focus is strong, and that only gets worse when we introduce a new one who is a literal child. All that said, it's an overall really solid magical girl series, but given that it's more repetitive than most, despite having the clear ability to be more than that, it can feel like a little bit of a letdown. Still, it was a good intro to this franchise as a whole, and I am looking forward to watching more that this series has to offer. Anime finishes year number 53, Cyberpunk EdgeRunners, 7 out of 10. Well, that sure was a cyberpunk show, and I don't mean that in that it was definitely a story set in the universe of the game, but that it was very much taking its cues from other existing cyberpunk media. It was playing in a well-used sandbox. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Not everything needs to break new ground after all. Sometimes just doing something very well is more than enough. In this case, the biggest issue that I think EdgeRunners ran into is that there were only 10 episodes and that those 10 were split right down the middle into two separate arcs. The first was very well done, got me invested in the characters, and provided not only breakneck action, but a few good character moments as well. The second half was the rougher portion. I think it could have used another episode or two since a lot of the narrative felt a little rushed and there wasn't a ton of breathing room. It doesn't help that there is a somewhat unspecified time skip in there that makes it feel like there's just kind of a gap in the middle of the series. Just a short montage of what happened in the interim could have really smoothed that over, I think. The other problem is that most of the characters are pretty flat. Sure, a lot of them are interesting, but very few of them experience any change as a result of the story, which can leave them feeling a little bit shallow anyway. Granted, with the way that this all ends, a solid and fulfilling character arc is a little more difficult for everyone, but it's still possible. It's a case of something not being particularly bad, but that I know it could have been better. All that being said, even if those aspects were weaker, they were made up for a lot by the animation and presentation of this one. This might not be Trigger at their most Trigger, but it's certainly up there. Movement is fluid and beautiful in frantic action scenes that are all impressively done. The staging and shot composition are likewise amazing, and it's all accentuated with a great soundtrack. The visual signifiers are clear and direct, so even when things are at their most wild, I never ended up feeling like I wasn't aware of what was happening. It's good stuff. My only gripe is with the nudity, and not for the reason you might expect. You see, nudity and sexuality go hand in hand with the cyberpunk genre. When everything about your body and your life is a commodity, what else do you have left after all? In fact, I liked the way that nude bodies in the show were framed very matter-of-factly, rather than trying to play them up as something that we should be ogling at. However, it never felt like the show was commenting on this at all or using it thematically, so it came off more as a, we're not on TV, so look what we can get away with. Anime finished this year number 54, Summertime Rendering, 6 out of 10. This is a show I really wish I could have more positive feelings about, truly. When it first started, it was a really intriguing mystery and thriller with some time loop elements that I was excited for. However, as things went on, it got less and less focused on that, adding in more action battle elements until the last few episodes were just not great. For something that had been all about planning and strategy, to see it veer away from that at the end was disappointing. It didn't help that the ending happened in a way where some of the biggest sacrifices that we were led to believe were truly sacrifices, there was no resetting them, weren't the sacrifice that we thought they were. Sure, I love a happy ending as much as the next girl, but this went beyond just happy and almost into sickeningly saccharine. It's definitely a case where the back half isn't as good as the front, where the mysteries are being established and figured out, but that didn't mean it was lacking fun. In fact, it was a pretty fun ride most of the time. The time travel mechanics were an interesting take, where the protagonist goes back less time each time he does, the window closing more and more until there is no going back. It's a cool concept, and there are some places where the use of it is interesting, even better when we find out that the enemy is just as aware that he can make these loops. However, it's undeniable that some choices made in the effort to smooth this out can come off as a little cheap, like a character having the ability to transfer their memory to others, so there's no need to explain things until the point comes that that character is incapacitated. Even then, that's laid enough in the story that everyone trusts our looper enough on things that he doesn't need to bother explaining. It doesn't help that some of the characters remain on the flat side despite a clear attempt to make them more complex and interesting. It's one of those cases where I ended up caring about them only because the more interesting characters did, not because I actually cared. And then there's the issue of the fan service. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, not all fan service is bad, but in this case it is jarring, distracting, and completely out of keeping with the tone that the story otherwise sets. In a show that is clearly going for some level of maturity, a repeating panty shot feels juvenile. There's a character that spends a good portion of the show in nothing but a swimsuit. Yes, there's an explanation for it, but it feels more like a justification to just keep her in a swimsuit. Perhaps the most jarring thing that I came across was a scene in which the resident pervert character stumbles upon another character, a large-chested woman that he is aware of, and she is seriously injured. He greets her with something like, "Oh, it's Miss F Cup." Gross, but in character for him. And she, who has been part of the thriller plot and doesn't have time to lose, takes the time to correct him on her actual cup size. Is it a joke? Yes. However, it's out of place and out of character, which makes it a distraction from the wider story. Like I said, I wish I could like this one more. There was a stretch around the end of the first core that I was really having a good time, but a weakened second half really did it in. Something it feels like a lot of shows are suffering from lately. Anime finished this year number 55, Futari wa Pretty Cure Max Heart, 5 out of 10. So this was basically just more Futari wa Pretty Cure. That's not really a bad thing, but it did mean that it suffered from a lot of the same issues as the original, as well as sharing its high points. That being said, all of it was ever so slightly better than the original. It felt like it had more impact and the characters were all a little more defined, but like I said, it was only ever so slightly. For example, the villains actually have a scrap of personality now compared to basically nothing before, but that tiny scrap isn't enough to make them fully interesting either. Hikari is a nice addition as a character, and I do like her a lot, but I do think there are elements about her that are unresolved. For how much she seems to question her place in the world, we never truly see her have a moment where she realizes it. Sure, she thinks back on all that she loves at the end of the series before what is meant to be a moment of sacrifice, but it comes off more as pointing out her attachments than her realizing anything about where she belongs. This isn't helped by this big moment being undercut really hard in the final episode with little more than a shrug from the show, as though they couldn't trust that kids could handle a bittersweet ending. And while I think that everything this season was a touch better done, that didn't mean that it didn't all feel repetitive in its own way, as we continued to follow concepts from the last season, but didn't evolve the formula at all. When it got to the point that they were recycling whole episode plots, but just with a different character as the focus of the episode, it felt like they were dragging their feet and padding it to get it to run 4 cores like the first one did. This isn't helped by the fact that there is a strong disconnect between the slice-of-life elements of the series and the action elements of the series. It's very rare that they are having a problem that they figure out the solution to during the fight, or the fight helps them work through, and more that they are doing something and then the bad guy shows up, they fight them, and then they finish what they were doing. Still, it's a solid Magical Girl series, and built a strong base for the franchise to build off of. I just want to see some more growth and development when it comes to the formula of the rest of the Precure shows that will be following it up. Anime finished this year number 56, Shinepost, 5 out of 10. Shinepost is a show that I was always kind of on the verge of dropping early in the season. I have to admit, I'm not a huge fan of idols, and the way that they were really leaning hard into those gimmicks with the characters the whole time was rubbing me the wrong way. However, there was one thing that Shinepost was really great at, and it was the episode cliffhanger, which was always enough to make me go, yeah, I guess I can give this one more week. That, and the fact that the animation was pretty well done early on, with some actually beautifully fluid 2D cuts in the first episode that were enough to hold my interest at first. This faltered as the show went on, but given that it suffered pretty strong episode delays due to a rash of COVID at the studio, it's understandable that some areas may have taken a hit. The CG used for the performances was also actually really well done, especially if I had to compare it to some other shows that I've seen lately. Some of the characters did grow on me, though at the same time others never really did. They were just a bit hit and miss, though thankfully those gimmicks ended up being toned down in the latter half of the series. There was a lot more focus on the personal hang-ups of characters being what's holding them back, but at the same time, I never really bought into most of it. That's not to say that they were really poorly done or anything like that, I just never felt like I really connected with any of them. This was especially true when we came to near the end of the series, and Haru, our lead girl's hang-up, was that she is too good at idling. Like, yeah, I get what they were going for to some extent, but it felt far less grounded than, for example, when one of the other girls had imposter syndrome or felt like she was falling behind the others. Then there was the manager, which there's nothing particularly wrong with him, but he had a bad case of Mr. Fix-It syndrome, where he's able to easily fix everything, no matter the problem. He hardly feels like a character and more like a plot device, which he really is, just a way for us to see when one of the girls is lying. Something that ended up being somewhat underutilized, I found. It's a case where I think the series could have been more compelling without him swooping in to patch up all their hang-ups, and if instead they worked together to figure out their issues and sort them out, which I think would have actually sold me on their camaraderie a lot more.